Welcome to the 2012 Borah Symposium. My name is Kelsey Perez, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Borah Committee. This year marks the 74 years since the first Borah Foundation sponsored program, which featured an address by then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. It also marks the 64th consecutive annual Borah Symposium, dating from the 1948 event titled The Causes of War and the Conditions for Peace. The 2012 Symposium, Food and War, Cultivating Peace, explores the connections between hunger, population, sustainability, war, and peace. So here's a full schedule of events. Right now, award-winning writer and food activist Raj Patel will address causes of war and conditions for peace, food's role. Yesterday, Monday, April 9th, the Borah Symposium opened with the screening of Darwin's Nightmare, 2004 Academy Award nominee for Best Documentary, followed by panel discussion. Earlier this morning, Dr. Guy R. Knudsen, professor of microbial ecology and plant pathology, presented food security in Haiti. Tomorrow, Wednesday, April 11th at 11:30 a.m. in the Silver and Gold Room, a panel of small-scale Palouse farmers will discuss the importance of sustainable local food production in a globalized society. Also tomorrow, at 7 p.m. here in the sub-ballroom, the 2012 Borah Symposium will conclude with physicist and internationally renowned environmentalist activist Dr. Vandana Shiva's presentation on water wars and the future of food. If you're tweeting during the symposium, we invite you to use the hashtag #UofIBorah. The Borah Foundation Committee wishes to sincerely thank the Marin Institute, the Environmental Science Program, the University of Idaho's Sustainability Center, the Office of Community Partnerships, the Women's Center, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the Environmental Science Program, the College of Education, and Terra Graphics for their support for this year's symposium. In addition, the Office of the President and the Borah Foundation co-sponsored a reception for symposium participants. Tonight's speakers' books will be on sale outside of the ballroom, and there will be a book signing at the end of the event. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. M. Duane Nellis, President of the University of Idaho. President Nellis was selected as the University of Idaho's 17th president on July 1st, 2009, and has quickly helped move the University of Idaho forward with record student enrollments, increased research funding, and extended university programs that help the people of the state educationally and economically. He's done all of this while successfully meeting the challenges of declining state budget support. Also, President Nellis brought the university community together to develop a new 5-year strategic plan to move the university forward, to own its own destiny. As the Chief Executive Officer of Idaho's flagship research and land-grant university, he is responsible for nearly 14,000 employees and students, as well as a budget in excess of $453 million. President Nellis is recognized nationally and internationally for his research utilizing satellite data and geographic information systems to analyze various dimensions of the Earth's land surface. His research has led to more than 100 articles and 15 books and book chapters. He is also nationally recognized and active. He serves as a commissioner for the Northwest Commission of Colleges and Universities, one of the 8 nationally recognized bodies that determine whether higher education institutions are accredited. Governor Butch Otter also appointed him as a commissioner of the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education that coordinates higher education efforts for 15 Western states. He has also held other leadership positions and continues to be active in other national bodies, including the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, the Association of American Geographers, the National Council for Geographic Education, and Gamma Theta Upsilon, the International Geographic Honor Society. Please help me welcome our own president, Dr. M. Duane Nellis.
Thank you, Kelsey. That was a very nice introduction. I really appreciate that. There was one word there that I really liked, particularly flagship. Did you hear her say that? Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, the flagship university in the state of Idaho, we're very proud of that. And welcome to everyone, honored guests and friends. You know, in the United States, we often think it's a land of plenty, and we often take our food for granted. In fact, the amount of money that we spend as part of our total income on food is the lowest in the world as far as discretionary income that we have for food. The privileges we have around food are truly extraordinary. We have ready access to food, and it's become a hallmark of the American national persona, and it's, some people would say, unfortunate the way it's spread across the world. You know, the McDonald's, the KFCs, all of these worldwide now, and it's interesting to see what has happened with these food icons throughout the world. However, as we all know, much of the world sees food very differently, and for many, it's a need that may go unfilled on a daily basis. Yet the truth can be even uglier. For some, food is a tool to manipulate or to punish others. Thus, the focus of this year's Borah Symposium on food and war, cultivating peace. It's a natural extension of our efforts as a university to help feed the world and help provide it with clean water. These are significant challenges, and we need to understand how our best efforts in the lab and fields may be frustrated by other forces. Disruption and manipulation of food supplies spurs instability, which often produces further problems. Food insecurity is just one aspect of human security, which is the focus of the Borah Foundation. In 1929, Chicago attorney Salmon Levinson established the William Edgar Borah Outlawry of War Foundation at the University of Idaho to honor and continue the work of Idaho State Senator William Borah on behalf of peace. We use the shortened name of the Borah Foundation now, but the cause is more relevant than ever. Supported by the university's Martin Institute, the Borah Foundation advances research and teaching about the causes of conflict and peaceful resolution. For more than 50 years, as Kelsey said, the Borah Foundation has sponsored an annual program examining the causes of war and the conditions necessary for lasting peace. Now tonight's speaker, Raj Patel, Dr. Raj Patel, is a policy analyst and activist who has both worked for international organizations like the World Bank and protested against them as well. He holds a PhD in development sociology from Cornell. Dr. Patel is a visiting scholar in the Center for African Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He's a fellow at the Institute of Food and Development Policy, and he's a research associate at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and previously he was a policy analyst for Food First. After working for the World Bank, interning at the World Trade Organization, and consulting for the United Nations, Dr. Patel became a harsh critic of their methods and says he has been tear-gassed on 4 continents protesting against them. Dr. Patel is involved in several international organizations, including the Land Research Action Network and the Southern Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute and African Initiative to strengthen Africa's capacity to be more effective in the global trading system. His most recent book, The Value of Nothing: How to Reshape Market Society and Redefine Democracy, proposes changes to the way we organize our political and economic lives to reduce flaws in the market system, if not eliminate the system completely. He also examines the cost of externalities in food production, and this involves the unseen cost of food production outside the supply chain, with specific emphasis on environmental and social costs. Previously, he authored Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, which discusses the worldwide food crisis and his proposed solutions. Indeed, it's an honor and privilege to introduce to you tonight our speaker for the Borah Symposium. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Raj Patel.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, President Nellis and the Martin Institute, the Borah Committee, and of course, all of you for joining me here. Now, food and war have been fellow travelers ever since both existed. The idea of the siege is one of the primal weapons of war. But war and food have shaped the world in which we live today and threaten to shape the world tomorrow. And I want to sort of just give you a sense of how these two forces combine by just sort of reeling off a couple of stories. I mean, did you know, for example, that the modern science of nutrition and the modern idea of the controlled experiment were products of the sort of confluence of food and war? The story goes like this, that the British East India Company was concerned about sailors developing scurvy. Scurvy, you know, the deficit of vitamin C that affects sailors. And the Surgeon General for the British East India Company came up with a range of cures. You know, he proposed fresh food, he proposed sulfuric acid, he proposed gruel and vinegar, and something called elixir vitriol. Now, the trouble was that no one really knew whether these worked or not. And so in the 1740s, a young ship's captain figured that what he would do was give some to each of the scurvy-ridden sailors and see what happened. And this was the first example of a modern controlled experiment. And as a result of this, the ship's surgeon, James Lind, wrote a book called A Treatise on Scurvy that not only helped to explain how this disease came about, but provided the context in which modern experiments happen and launched the investigations that would subsequently discover the idea of vitamin C as well as a range of other vitamins. And of course, as I was explaining to some of you earlier on today, vitamin is the correct pronunciation. And of course, I mean, I can tell you stories about this. I can tell you stories about tomatoes, if only just to encourage you to pronounce that correctly as well. I mean, as I said, there are a range of things, unexpected things that have come to us through war and food. Canning, modern canning, was invented by the French, who, again, the French military were very keen on seeing food preserved over long distances, and it is through their ingenuity of controlled sort of condition that modern Spam owes its origin. So we can blame the French for that as well. But and again, it's easy enough to sort of regale you with stories about Coca-Cola in the Second World War or Burger King in the Gulf War, and I would be happy to regale you with those if you're interested. But the story, I mean, these stories need to be stitched together with an argument. And so let me tell you the argument that I'm going to make. First, I mean, the argument is this, that we need actually ways of engaging in conflict much better than we do at the moment if we are to avoid wars for food. So what I'm saying is conflict is unavoidable, but the ways in which we manage that conflict matter a great deal. And to give you a sense of how this would work, I'm going to go on a sort of logical journey. First of all, what I'm going to do is revisit the most important war of the 20th century. And that war shaped the way in which we think about food at the moment, the way we eat today, and the way that we're planning to feed the world tomorrow. And then I'm going to suggest that the consequences of that war and food are gravely and profoundly misguided. And the way we think about that original war needs to be revisited. And then I'm going to suggest that actually the ways that are going to feed us in the 21st century will embrace conflict but reject war. And that's an argument that I'm very excited to be sharing with you because it involves some of the most cutting-edge ideas around how we manage resources and how we can farm in the future. So first of all, the most important war of the last century was Cold War. Because it lasted the longest and it had the most dramatic impacts worldwide. Now, it's not often noticed that the Cold War also involved food. And it involved what has come to be known in ag circles as the Green Revolution. Now, the Green Revolution is not, many of you may not have heard of this idea of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution wasn't about, solar power and hemp. It was the Green Revolution. It was a specific set of interventions around agriculture, agricultural technology, and the government and the state's role in promoting agriculture. And let me give you a quote from the man who coined the term in its agricultural context. The man's name is William Goud. Goud was the Secretary of the United States Agency for International Development. And he was telling, he came up with this idea of the Green Revolution in a quote, in a speech that he gave in 1968 at the Society for International Development in Washington, D.C. And he said this, and he's talking about sort of the marvels of increased productivity that have happened as a result of hybrid seeds and fertilizer and irrigation and what have you. And he says, these and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the making of a new revolution. It is not a violet-red revolution like that of the Soviets. It is not a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I call it the Green Revolution. I should be in the movie business. And now, the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution, when you look at this thing that he was pointing to, the Green Revolution, it actually seems pretty good. As a result of increasing fertilizer and the irrigation and the spread of extension services, credit to farmers, marketing boards, what have you, record harvests were achieved in many countries. Rice production in Indonesia, for example, increased by 275% between 1966 and the year 2000. Chile witnessed a 200 kilo per hectare per year growth in the yields of maize after they adopted Green Revolution technologies for decades. And the proof is in the pudding. By 1990, nearly 75% of Asia's rice and half of the wheat in Africa, Latin America, and Asia were Green Revolution varieties. It's estimated that roughly sort of 40% of all farmers in the developing world were using Green Revolution seeds in the 1990s. And it seems to have worked. This stuff produces more food. The Green Revolution doubled food supply in Asia in 25 years, with only a 4% increase in the amount of land that's used. So double the amount of food and only 4% more of the land. That sounds terrific. While global population increased by 110%, food supply increased by 174%. So food supply has outstripped the population growth. And it has continued to do so. Now, today, we produce more food per person than ever before in human history. So when you have these sort of worries about population, and we'll come to those in a second. When you have worries about population, if you look at food produced per person on Earth today, there's more than there ever has been. So that seems like a ringing endorsement of the Green Revolution. And it's worth looking at how it happened. Well, if you look at the conventional histories of the Green Revolution, it goes like this, that in 1941, the Rockefeller Foundation, at the urging of the US Vice President, who had recently returned from Mexico, embarked on a program to improve Mexican agriculture. And they started this thing called the Mexican Agriculture Project, and they sent a small team, including a young scientist, a plant breeder called Norman Borlaug, and they sent him down in 1944 to Mexico, and he left his wife and his pregnant wife and his child to head down there to develop wheat varieties that would spread around the world. Norman Borlaug, a very idealistic young man, he was working at DuPont at the time, and they offered to double his salary to keep him there. But no, he went off to feed the world, and he crossed Japanese wheat varieties, short Japanese wheat varieties with indigenous varieties and in Mexico, and came up with this amazing miracle wheat. It spread around the world. Wheat yields took off, and by 1970, Norman Borlaug had earned himself the Nobel Peace Prize that he was awarded in that year. So that's the sort of conventional history, and it sounds great. But here's where we need to start tugging at a thread or two. First of all, why Mexico and why then? Well, until late 1940, Mexico's president was a man called Lázaro Cárdenas, and he was the left-wing architect of modern corporatism in the country. So basically, this was a guy who instituted land reform. He took land from the rich and he distributed it to the poor. And he also expropriated some of the largest companies in Mexico. In particular, he took the assets of the Standard Oil Company, and he nationalized them into what is now Pemex, the Mexican national oil company. And in that year, he lost the election to a right-wing candidate, whom the US vice president went down to meet in 1940, Ávila Camacho, who, while keeping some of Cárdenas's changes, also signaled his allegiances, because he banned the communists in Mexico from running for office. And right here, just as soon as you start asking the question about the Green Revolution, you notice something, that in the background there is this fear and this worry about communism. And that matters. I mean, it's not accidental that the Rockefeller Foundation starts funding the research into wheat growing and starts backing this regime that is anti-communist. Of course, the Rockefeller Foundation got its money from the Standard Oil Company, and with the assets of the Standard Oil Company expropriated, the Rockefeller Foundation was very keen to prevent the spread of communism, and so they invested in wheat research. That makes no sense at all, does it? Why is it? How is it that you can fight communism through wheat research? What's the logic that brings us from, we're worried about communism over here, and so we're investing in growing wheat? Well, in order to tie it together, we need to thank another employee of the British East India Company, a man called Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was the world's first paid economist. And just a quick show of hands. Have you heard of sort of Thomas Malthus's population theory? Many of you, most of you have heard this. For those of you who haven't, this is the part of the talk where normally it would be nice to sort of draw something, but I don't like to use PowerPoint because I don't like to insult people's intelligence. So what I'd like you to do is just imagine the sort of Malthusian graph. Now, Thomas Malthus observes this. He observes that animals can reproduce at a geometric rate. You can get, you've got 2 rabbits, then you've got 4, then you've got 8, then you've got 6, then you've got a ton of rabbits. So they're reproducing geometrically. So imagine this sort of smooth geometric curve. But at the same time, food growth is increasing arithmetically. So there's only a sort of set amount you can add each year. And so these 2 curves at some point will intersect. The population will outstrip the food supply. And this is a moment of Malthusian catastrophe. This is where the population is, its sort of sexual desires outstrip its desires to feed. And so basically, Thomas Malthus sort of has this idea that this is what people are like, that we are, particularly poor people, are reducible to sort of raging genitalia and growling stomachs. And the combination of these 2 things means that there will be more and more, particularly poor people, demanding more and more food. And at some point, there will come a moment of catastrophe. And when that catastrophe happens, the people who have food will be very worried, because then changes will be afoot. And this was a sort of logic that actually was articulated in the 1940s by politicians who observed that if there were food riots, it was very clear that the change that people, on the streets, angry, so I suppose they have a third organ, which is the clenched fist, angry about the shortage of food, they would demand change and they would become communist. So does that sort of tie these two things together? You've got the wheat here and you've got communism over here, but they're tied together by this Malthusian idea of what poor people will do when they get hungry and angry. Even though it's a very reductive argument, it reduces poor people, as I say, to sort of libido and hunger. But it's interesting that this logic isn't far away. Think of the Arab Spring. You'll remember that the Arab Spring began in Algeria as a result of the rise in the price of wheat in 2011, in January, early January 2011. Now, of course, in Algeria, the Arab Spring was crushed, but in Tunisia, it was not. And what was the last thing that President Ben Ali did before he fled the country to Malta? He dropped the price of bread, because he thought that a crowd that was better able to feed itself would be less likely to throw him out of office. But by then, of course, it was too late. So all of this to say that this sort of weird logic of people reducible to basically these appetites that are uncontrolled will at some point lead to social change and turmoil. That's the logic behind the Green Revolution. Now, you may say, well, all right, that's fine, but did it work? And the answer is, well, kind of. In order for the Green Revolution to happen, you didn't just need these hybrid seeds. You also needed a strong government to make people adopt those seeds. And you also needed a government that was interested in population control, because population control was also part of the Green Revolution, right? In order to, the Green Revolution was a sort of double-headed thing. On the one hand, it was pushing up the food curve so that you had more food per person, but it was also trimming off population growth so that there were fewer people around to eat that food. And the authoritarian governments that adopted the Green Revolution, and what's striking is that if you look at the countries that adopted the Green Revolution, all of them except Peru are countries that are in the grip of authoritarianism and dictatorship. Even India, interestingly, which is often cited as the country where the Green Revolution happened, where the world's largest democracy and everything was fine, went through an emergency period under Indira Gandhi. And it's not often talked about, but you can read it in a fantastic book called A Fine Balance. It's a fiction book, but it's really one of the finest books about India you are likely to read. So A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. But in this, the emergency period in India involved two things, right? It involved the extension of the Green Revolution in terms of fertilizer and that the government bought at a set price. But it was also a time of compulsory sterilization. There were sterilization programs enacted by Indira Gandhi's son as a way of taking pressure off the regime at the time and to make sure that communism was kept in check. And you may say, well, look, I don't like authoritarian governments, but surely this, surely it ended hunger at least, Raj. We may say, yes, that's fine. India and the Philippines and Indonesia and Mexico were all, in some senses, authoritarian countries, but that's okay. I don't mind as long as people were at least fed. So here's the bad news: that if you take, it's true that there were fewer hungry people in 1990 than there were in, say, 1960. But if you take China, a country that was not a part of the Green Revolution, but was part of the Red Revolution. If you take China out, world hunger actually increased by 11%, from 536 to 597 million people. In South America, where per capita food supplies actually increased by 8%, the number of hungry people also went up by 19%. So the amount of food went up by 8%, but the number of hungry people went up by 19%. And this is a moment to sort of take a step back and say, well, all right, we've increased the food supply. Why are people going hungry? Well, let's just ask that question in a context with which we're all familiar. Let's look at the United States. It would take someone with a spectacular failure of imagination to claim that the United States does not have food. It would be, we can go into any supermarket here and find quite a lot of it. We can go into the fields just outside this town and see amber waves of grain, perhaps not this time of year, but a little later on. And there are enough chickpeas and garbanzo beans to be able to feed the 5,000. We have a lot of food here. So why is it that we live in a country where 1 in 5 people are going hungry? This is a country where 48 1.2 million people are food insecure, where families at some point during the year do not know where their next meal is coming from. This is a country where 1 in 4 children is on some sort of food assistance in school, where 1 in 2 children at some point in their childhood, 1 in 2 children in one of the richest countries ever, with no shortage of food, 1 in 2 children will be on some sort of food assistance in their childhood. That's not something that's widely spoken about, but it hides in plain sight in this country. And yet no one says, well, we don't have enough food in this country and we need to grow more. It's pretty clear we've got plenty of food. And it's pretty clear, as President Nellis was saying, that we spend much less of our income on food than anyone else. But the fact is that if you are poor in this country, then even that fraction of your income that you're able to spend on food is not enough to make it through the week. And that's why we have 48.2 million people who are food insecure. So the problem with the Green Revolution in terms of fighting hunger is this, that yes, it increases output, but it doesn't necessarily increase people's entitlement to food, their ability to be able to access that food. And so you can say, well, look, let's agree to disagree about this whole increasing food production thing. Maybe it was good for the environment, because this is Norman Borlaug's hypothesis is that if we hadn't used these technologies, we would have used 3 times as much farmland as in fact we have had used. So, we've used basically about 600 million hectares globally to feed the world. Without these technologies, we'd have used 1,800 million hectares. So 1.8 trillion hectares. And again, I'd be into that. I mean, if there was some way for us to chop by a third the amount of land that we're using to grow food, that would be terrific. The trouble is it's come at a huge environmental cost, and I'm sure Vandana tomorrow will talk a lot about that, about the water stress and about the farmer suicides in India that have come in their wake. But what's interesting is, even if you look at the data, most recent projections suggest that actually the Green Revolution has only saved maybe 5% of land. So without the Green Revolution, we'd have used merely 5% more land than we have. But there's a second response to Norman Borlaug, and this is the interesting response. The interesting response is, look, let's imagine a world without the Green Revolution, but with something else instead. What would that something else look like? And posing that question of Norman Borlaug, so let's take the Green Revolution away and not imagine that we just did nothing, but that we did something differently. If we did something differently, what would that be? And I want to come to that, because I think that that's really where the possibilities for peace existing at the same time as conflict when it comes to food are to be found. But before I do that, I do have to say that actually there's been a gap between the end of the first Green Revolution and where we find ourselves now, where things have gotten worse. So not only are we now in a world where we're in a world today where we produce more food per person than ever before, but where there are now 1.5 billion people who are overweight and near enough 1 billion people who are malnourished. So despite Green Revolution technologies, there are 1 billion people now who are not getting enough to eat, despite us having more food per person than ever before. And the problem, again, is not that we don't have enough food, it's because the way we distribute it is through the market. And when you distribute something as fundamental as food through the market works as it should. It rations. And so if you are able to pay, you're able to eat a great deal. If you're able to pay well, you're able to eat good food. But if you're not able to pay, then you're able to eat only poorly. And if you're not able to buy anything, then you go hungry. And unfortunately, since the end of the Green Revolution, a few other things have happened to make that the sort of marketization of food much, much worse. And it's been pushed by an organization that I have worked for. And yes, President Ellis pointed out that, yes, I have in fact worked for the World Bank. I mean, do I have to explain how the World Bank works? Are people familiar with the World Bank? I should explain. But I also have limited time, so I'm going to use my shortcut. The World Bank is a complex institution. It's an organization that is in the business of loans and conditionality and the provisioning of certain kinds of economic advice that restructure global economies. And I'm sure you would have heard today in the talk about Haiti, about how Haiti's Haiti's exposure to the world market came as a result of World Bank and IMF loans. But it's hard to, particularly this time of day in a room as hot as this, to keep focused on that. So I want to use an analogy from. Have you seen the Terry Gilliam film Time Bandits? I mean, are you familiar with the Terry Gilliam film Time Bandits? Okay. So those of you who are not familiar with it, it is a group. It's a movie about disgruntled former employees of God. We know that the universe was built in 6 days, so it was a rush job. And God had help, but he didn't treat his workers well. So you have these disgruntled workers who use the fact that the universe is a kind of botched job, and they have a map of the holes in the universe. And they use these holes to rob people. And so it's, so they rob Napoleon, and they jump through a hole in the universe, and they end up in Sherwood Forest, where they're met by Robin Hood, who's played by John Cleese, who's a kind of British upper-class twit. And he introduces himself as Hood. And he's very excited to see all Napoleon's stuff. And he says, well, thank you very much indeed. Well, this is terrific. The poor will love this. Have you met the poor? They're charming people. Of course, they don't have 2 pennies to rub together. That's because they're poor. And so he sets about redistributing this stuff to the poor. Bring on the poor. And so it's a line of the poor. And he starts handing stuff out. And, rubies for you, yes, jolly good, congratulations, well done. And gilded mirror for you, yes, how long have you been poor? Well, really, jolly good. And then right next to him is this big bloke who takes whatever Hood has given and punches the poor person in the face. So that's how the World Bank works. It's not inaccurate. When I worked for the World Bank, I worked on a project called Voices of the Poor. Can anyone hear us? And it was basically the World Bank's way of saying, have you met the poor? We had lunch with them yesterday. They love us. They think we're terrific. And the World Bank is, of course, in the business of giving out these large loans, often to repay previous loans that the World Bank also gave out. But at the moment of signing these things, that's all forgotten. It's all celebratory. But of course, it's a bank, so the loans come back. And then there's the punch in the face. And the punch in the face comes from the neoliberal economic ideology, the kind of ideology that says that what we need to do is let free markets sort out everything. We need to let the free market do the resource allocation. And they did that. They've been doing that in Africa for 20, 30, 40 years. So really, since the 1980s, is when the Green Revolution state institutions were dismantled and the free market was ushered in. And the trouble is that when the free market was ushered in, no large agricultural corporations wanted to invest in Africa, and so the invisible hand was nowhere to be seen. There was no investment in agriculture in Africa. Excuse me for a second. So you have this sort of perverse situation where you have sort of more free markets, but none of the infrastructure that you need for the green revolution to succeed. Remember, the Green Revolution wasn't just about the seeds; it was about that authoritarian state. It was about making sure that there were marketing boards that bought from farmers at a particular price, that pushed out this fertilizer and pesticide and invested in infrastructure. None of that was made possible in Africa. None of that was allowed in Africa because of the way the World Bank sort of set its economic policy. Instead, what you've had is an increased sort of intensity of markets in food. And that's really been characterized most recently by 2 new markets in food. The first, of course, to do with the speculation in the price of food. You'll remember that in 2008, the price of food went up. And that was because of new actors in the food system. Really, since 1990, the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index provided a new way for financial companies to get a long-term return on food. There is a lot of debate within the community of economists about whether money is being made by speculating on food. There are a lot of economists who say, look, for every for every trader who makes the big bet on grain and wins, and is off driving a Maserati, there is another trader who is losing his shirt, and so in the end these even out. But if you talk to traders, they seem to be fairly convinced that the economists have got it wrong. And of course, this wouldn't be the first time that reality had failed to live up to the expectations of economists. What we're seeing certainly is, and we see it in congressional testimony, we see it certainly from the interviews I've conducted with people in the investment banking world, that commodities and the commodification of food and the trading of food, so the financialization of food, is something that is huge. And incredibly lucrative. And the second thing that we're seeing is the financialization and the commodification of land, particularly in Africa. You're seeing a new range of conflicts spurred by what are called land grabs. And in 2010, an area the size of France was bought by foreign investors mainly in Africa, but across the world, but usually in places where property rights and property contracts were very loose. And these leases were often granted by governments to these companies. Again, the World Bank was very excited by this. It's like, well, you'll have a willing buyer and a willing seller, and they will come together, and so the person sitting on the land in Africa hoeing away will suddenly get a big pot of money from whatever foreign multinational will come in and will give them a big pile of cash. And the landowner will be happy, and the multinational will be happy because they will invest in the land and they will get more out of the land, and it's win-win. The trouble is, there is no such willing buyer and willing seller in most of these land deals. What you have is a willing buyer, certainly, but you also have a willing seller who doesn't actually isn't using the land. Most of the land in Africa is owned by governments, not by individuals. And the people who are on the land are there through customary right, and they're just kicked off. And if the World Bank, as I say, was very keen to promote this as a kind of exciting way in which we could feed the world. But even they were unable to do the backflips necessary to get through the facts. And the facts are this, that in every case that they looked at, there's, particularly in Africa, a number of people are worse off, and particularly in every case they looked at, women were worse off. Women who, for example, carry water from land that has been grabbed. When you hear about land grabs in Africa, it's not like everyone's grabbing the Sahara. No, they're grabbing land with water, or land with minerals, or land with access to the sea, or land with natural gas deposits, or land that is a conduit from one place to another. And when they grab this land, governments often put in the infrastructure to help extract these resources. And the companies that buy this land are paying cents on the dollar of the real market value. And again, the people who are actually on the land are shoved off in the name of development and progress. So things have gotten worse through the spread of markets that allow these conflicts to fester and flourish. But I want, in the last sort of 10 minutes that I have, to present alternatives, because I think that there are alternatives, and they come from places that you might not expect. So first of all, we need to recognize that we are moving in a world toward a world where climate change matters more and more. We've seen the effects of climate change already. The fact that we had food riots in Mozambique in 2010, or that we have the Arab Spring looking the way that it did, sparked by grain shortages that were, again, the product of globally interconnected markets, and also strange weather events in global grain reserves. We are heading to a world where we need to embrace different methods of farming and different methods of distributing the way we produce food. And it seems to me that there are a lot of different farming techniques that we might look to. Now, oddly, some of the most interesting are to be found in Cuba. Now, I am no fan of state socialism and these large cooperatives. Cuba, funnily enough, was one of the world's largest importers of, and certainly Latin America's second or third largest, depending on how you look at it, importer of fertilizer and pesticide until about 1989. So it was a heavily industrialized food economy. And their job was to provide sugar and rum for the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union used to send tractors and fuel and agricultural chemicals. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, the government didn't know what to do. And so they did what they thought best, which was enforce collectivization and encourage people to band together and weather through it. And it was a catastrophe. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds over the 3 years that was called the special period. Yeah, I mean, Cubans have a particularly dark sense of humor, as dark as the rum, for dealing with their government. But what's interesting is that the Cuban peasants were organized, and they demanded change. Now, what they demanded was land reform, first of all, which is an amazing tool for thinking about increasing productivity. One of the best ways of increasing productivity, and we've seen it around the world, is actually to give the people who are on the land. So that way, they can invest in it, and they know that they will be able to give it to their kids. Now, under the previous situation in Cuba, they weren't allowed to do that. But after these reforms were pushed through, despite, the peasants had to fight their government to make it happen, but they were organized and they won. They were able to, you're still not able to buy and sell farmland, but you are able to keep it and pass it on to your children. So you don't need a free market in land, you just need security of tenure. And they have that now. And the other thing they have is scientists working with them in the fields. Cuba only has 2% of Latin America's population, but it has 11% of the PhDs. Those scientists were originally schooled in the kinds of nozzle head science that we have here. You apply this and you apply that, and you spray for this. The trouble is, there was nothing to come out of the nozzles, and so they had to relearn. And what they learned was a kind of agroecological farming that I think is really exciting for what it can tell us about climate change. Because I want to tell you a story of an experiment, not a controlled experiment, but one that happened perforce in 2008 when Hurricane Ike tore through Cuba. And here's what happened. In Cuba, you have a number of different systems. You have this agroecological system that involves lots of different farming. For example, instead of using fertilizer, you will grow leguminous plants. You'll grow beans that fix nitrogen in the soil. And instead of pesticides, you will have flowers that attract beneficial insects that keep that keep an insect population balanced. So you factor in that you're going to lose a little bit of your crop to nature so that you have enough so that your system is robust. And you work at every level of the canopy. And so you have this farming system, and right next to it you had examples of traditional monoculture, like we see out here, where you have row on row on row of, in this case, plantains. So Hurricane Ike tears through these two different farms that are very close to each other. A plantain monoculture and a plantain polyculture, an agroecological farm. So they have plantains, high plantains, medium plantains, and then they have ground crops. They have various things in between, you have sort of leguminous things. You have things that are used for fuel and for fiber and what have you. So the hurricane tears through, and it knocks down a large percentage of the trees in the monoculture. And because this is a monoculture, the labor isn't there. The labor is only brought in as a factor of production whenever harvests are needed. So the trees are less likely to be saved. And when they are saved, there's a smaller percentage of them surviving. Whereas in the polyculture, there's more labor at hand. So the farmers are close to where they farm, and they're able to save more of the trees. And the trees that can't be saved are used for fuel, and that's fine because there's more light getting lower down into the canopy that has a range, that allows for the range of other things to flourish. And they're using mulch, which absorbs much more of the moisture, and it's a robust system, robust enough that while it took 90 days for this polyculture to get back up and running, it took 180 days for the monoculture to reach the same thing. And 3 months in an agricultural year is an eternity. The fact is that this polyculture was more robust. Now, some people say, well, what if, and I've heard Jeffrey Sachs say this, what if there's a gene for climate change? Jeffrey Sachs has big hands, and he's a short man. So what if there's a gene for climate change, he says. And of course, this is a preposterous idea, because climate change is not one thing. Climate change is change. Sometimes it's bugs coming at the wrong time of year. Sometimes it's too much rain, it's too little rain, incredible heat. You can't have a single gene. But what you can do is develop a portfolio. because you don't know what the future will bring. And the best thing we've discovered, particularly through this financial crisis, is betting on one thing is a sure path to disaster, but having a portfolio is going to be your way to a more robust solution for a more uncertain future. But the last example, I do have enough time to give you another story and then a final example. And the other story is for us to start thinking differently about how we manage resources collectively. Because you'll remember, Thomas Malthus had us reduced really to these two basic urges of greed and reproduction, right? And the idea that we are these people, these selfish, greedy people, is incorrect. We are not selfish and greedy, or we're not only selfish and greedy people. And yet, you may think that certainly if you look at the way the modern economics represents us, you would think that we are incapable of managing resources together. Many of you might be familiar with the idea of the tragedy of the commons. Is this something that's on at least a few people's radar? For those of you who are not familiar with it, look, imagine all of us here are a happy village. Moscow, let us call ourselves. Not Moscow, I'm told. But now, so Moscow, and we're happy village, but the thing is we are Malthusian Muscovites. So we are greedy and selfish. That's all we are. And we are surrounded by a forest. And nobody owns the forest. So what happens? Well, we will go out and we will chop wood, and we will forage for nuts and berries, and we will shoot squirrels, because that's what we do. And we will do this, and because we are selfish and greedy, we will just carry on doing it. And because nobody owns the property, no one owns the forest in which we hunt and forage, no one stops us. And the way the tragedy of the commons works, what makes it tragic, is that with eyes wide open, we will destroy the resource, and one of us will chop down the last tree, and that will be the end of us, and that will be the end of Moscow. And that's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. And when you think about it, and you think about the Dust Bowl, and you think about the various kinds of environmental disasters that we're in the moment, you think, that's kind of right? We're all selfish and greedy. No. Actually, human beings are not pure animals of selfishness and greed. We are also hardwired, as a recent article in Nature pointed out, even from age 18 months, we have built in a capacity for fairness, for sensing fairness, and for reciprocating, and for altruism and for generosity. That's not to say we're not selfish. Of course we're selfish, but we're more than selfish. Even the most selfish among us, who are graduate students in economics, it's nothing personal, I'm just saying. Studies have shown that even people with the least ability to reciprocate and to be into altruism are still pretty altruistic. And the trouble is that when you see environmental disasters like the one that befell this country, if you look at the Dust Bowl, that wasn't the result of individual farmers doing that. That was a result of banks foreclosing on land, forcing farmers into the kinds of economic behavior that was desperate and not rational, and not the kind of thing that they wanted to do. But if you look at systems where people are allowed to set the rules and to engage in exchange and to be able to manage resources collectively without the government and without the private sector, people do much better. We have studies and the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that show that these common property resource regimes are much better for engaging and distributing resources than just allowing the government or the private sector to come in and do that for you. And it's hard to imagine what that would look like. And so I just want to end with a story that I think is really quite incredible and that suggests not only the kind of conditions for peace that we need, but also the kind of ways we need to manage conflict and the ways that we can manage resources together. And this is a story from Malawi. Now, Africa is on track, already is in fact experiencing climate change, although our government may be arguing about whether it's climate change or whether it's, to quote someone from Saturday Night Live, just God hugging us a little closer. In Africa, there seems to be quite a lot of consensus, particularly among the farmers I've spoken to, that things are changing in very weird ways. And so a lot of farmers in a project in northern Malawi have, as a result of a sort of nutrition project from a local hospital, have started experimenting. So there are 5,000 farmers who are part of this project. And what they're doing is experimenting with new ways of eating and growing food. And they're doing this because, the kinds of things traditionally they grew, like corn, maize, corn, and tobacco, they're not terribly nutritious. So what they're doing is moving to this kind of polyculture. And they're growing things like pearl millet and cowpea, and they're growing leguminous trees. And they're finding, for example, that because of climate change, it's getting much, much hotter at strange times of the year. And by having trees, by increasing shade cover by 30%, you increase yields by 30%. And, of course, these trees fix nitrogen in the soil, and they're doing this without water. They're doing it with dryland irrigation. They're working with the contours of the land. And then at the end of it, they have cowpea and they have pearl millet, and they're wondering what the hell to do with all of that. Because they're used to maize and tobacco. They don't, no one knows what to do with, cowpea and pearl millet. It's like kale. It's like a generation ago where people are like, what the hell is this? So what do? Well, they get together and they have recipe days where you have 50 families or so, and they get together and they cook and they share recipes about how to cook this stuff. And they share, farming techniques, and they share ideas about how it is that they farm. So you have 5,000 farmers in this context, 50 families, each of them a scientist, each of them an experimenter, each of them sharing the field cultivation and their experience of cooking. And then they have a conversation. And the conversation is about work. And so here's a pop quiz, because it's possible for these farmers to do very well and produce much more food than they would even with Green Revolution technologies. They do much better than with Green Revolution technologies. But here's a paradox. I'm just going to throw it out to you. It's possible for there to be more food in the fields and for infant malnutrition to go up. Why? Oh, just anyone. Wrong kind of food. No. In fact, this is better than what they had before, right? So it's stuff that's actually more nutritious than than maize, and certainly more nutritious than tobacco. So it's not that they're growing the wrong kind of food. Other ideas. They're selling it for money. That's another interesting idea. So the idea is, well, you have the stuff. It's a cash crop. It's being hauled out. To some extent, that's true, but that's not the main reason.
Inequitable distribution.
Inequitable distribution. Thank you. Yes. Well, kind of. You're never going to get it. So in Malawi, like in a lot of countries, harvesting is women's work. But it's also women's work to cook and to clean and to fetch water and to breastfeed. And so if there's more harvesting in the fields, what is it that goes? It's breastfeeding. And as soon as you know that, it's obvious, right? Of course. Well, if there's more harvesting, then breastfeeding. But, of course, this is the kind of thing that is invisible to architects of the Green Revolution. This is one of the reasons why, in the world today, 60% of the people going hungry are women or girls. It's not an innocent fact that there is this deeply inequitable distribution when it comes to hunger. And in Malawi, it is the case that in some cases where you have Green Revolution sort of increases in yield, women will sacrifice breastfeeding because they have no choice but to do all the other things, including harvesting. But at these recipe days, they have a conversation. And what do? They after the feeding and the sharing of recipes, women will call out men on the inequitable distribution of work. And they will say, well, look, it's not okay that I'm doing all of this stuff and you're responsible only for plowing and for planting, and then you'll take the stuff that I harvest and go off and drink it, sell it and drink the proceeds, or you'll just sit on your fat ass while I'm doing all of this stuff. And it's interesting because the personal is always political, but in this venue, the conflict becomes not only politicized, but it becomes a venue in which that conflict can lead to peace. In this venue, by talking about it in a safe space, but a space that's difficult, but a safe space, you end up having transformations in the way that women and men work together. One of the most invisible and yet one of the most important sites for conflict globally. And yet, here, because of this transformation, and here's the good news, men have started doing more work, and they've noticed huge increases not only in child nutrition, but also in men's participation in work in the home. And it's that kind of the possibility of managing conflict, of creating spaces in which we can talk about resources together, the ways in which we can talk about the distribution of resources in ways that are safe, that can actually lead us to, I think, a brighter future. I think that's the point that I want to leave on here. is that we've gone on a journey, right? We've seen that through sort of the traditional logic of the Cold War, the way to fight this sort of massive population increase was merely to produce more food and to engage in population control. But actually, if we're interested in a sustainable future, we need to pay deep attention to inequality, and that inequality starts in the household, but of course it goes all the way up to an international level. But we also need to create the spaces in which conflict can be managed equitably and to everyone's satisfaction. Because peace isn't the absence of conflict. Peace is the management of conflict to everyone's satisfaction. And that, I think, particularly when it comes to food, is why we need more democracy in our food system rather than less. But that's sadly been the history of our food system, is of actually a declining level of democracy. And as I say, we could look to Malawi, but I'm seeing more and more of this stuff happening here as well. In the sort of efflorescence of food policy councils in the United States, for instance. You're seeing local municipalities getting together to make sure that no one in their municipality goes hungry. So you're bringing in small business, and you're bringing in farmers, and you're bringing in unions, and you're bringing in teachers, and you're bringing in anti-hunger advocates, and you're bringing in the food bank, and you're working to build a city or a community in which hunger never happens again, where the food bank puts itself out of business. And that's, I mean, I have to say that's, and I'm seeing a great deal of it, particularly driven by young people in this country. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I became American last year, is because I think that there is a lot happening here, and I want to be a part of that. I mean, obviously, I also became American because when I go on a protest, I don't want to get deported. But of course, going on a protest is what made this country what it is. If you look at everything that is right and beautiful about this country, it happened not because it was given, but because it was demanded by the 99%. And that, I think, is what I want to leave you on. Thank you very much indeed.
Let's give another round of applause to our speaker tonight.
And again.
Now we have some time for some Q&A. On the left and on the right side, there are some microphones. If you guys have any questions concerning the lecture.
Can we turn up the lights a little bit so I can just see you?
Hi.
Hi.
So I have a question. So your time at the World Bank, we hear a lot of horror stories, Jamaica in the 90s. You mentioned African nations present. And I'm just wondering, at your time at the World Bank, were there any instances where you saw that they did do some good? And if not, what do you think they could do in their programs?
Thank you very much indeed. So the question is, has there been a time where the World Bank has done some good? And sorry, the second part of it was?
Well, I asked during your time at the World Bank.
Oh, no, my time at the World Bank was, I don't know, 4 months, because I was part of I was brought on by my PhD supervisor, who was writing this epic report on the World Bank's sort of views on poverty. And my job was to analyze the World Bank's classified literature to see what they were doing. And we went through all this literature. It was like, hundreds of thousands of pages, and we coded it all up, and we said, and we observed that in many places people were upset at the World Bank, and so we flagged that. And then, mysteriously that dropped as a priority in this report that we were writing. In the end, it disappeared. But my supervisor quit before I did, so I was there for a very short period of time. Nonetheless, I do think the World Bank has done one or two interesting things. The World Bank produced a report called the International, you'll love this one, the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development. It was, yes, IAASTD. They didn't go to acronym school, these people. So the A school, as we call it. This ISTAT report was really interesting because what it did was say, well, look, all right, how are we going to feed the world in 2050? and the answer was, well, actually conventional farming, industrial farming, and genetically engineered crops haven't shown the promise that they, or rather, industrial farming is not sustainable, and genetically modified crops are not showing as much promise as one might have hoped. And so we do need other ways of farming, and we also need to be thinking about more urban and peri-urban farming. Now, for the World Bank to be saying that, I thought was quite remarkable, which is why the report really has been suppressed ever since. I mean, there have been these moments of independent scientific inquiry where people have genuinely been free to say what they want to say, and that has been that's been very interesting. So they had a sort of a review of extractive resources and of climate change, and they decided they shouldn't be spending so much on extractive resources and climate change, and then they ignored that advice. So there have been a lot of reports that the World Bank has done, and some knowledge that they have produced that I think has been very interesting. But because it has provoked and challenged the status quo, it has generally been forgotten and left to languish on the shelves. But in general, the World Bank's job, I mean, it says it's in the development business, but it's there to sort of manage crises in capital. I mean, it's there as a development bank and to make the world safe for businesses. I mean, that's its kind of mission right now. And then pick up the pieces when some of that falls apart. But in general, I think we do need to be thinking not about electing someone groovy to the head of the World Bank. In the same way that we wouldn't want someone groovy helming the Titanic. I mean, it doesn't much matter who's on deck. What matters, I think, is what we first need to do is think about reparations and debt forgiveness. I mean, beyond debt forgiveness, but actually reparations for some of the damage that has been caused, which the World Bank itself admits. But then we do need to be thinking about thinking about the debt that we owe the global South. The standard of living that we have here is made possible by extraction from, and centuries of extraction from the global South. And that's something that the World Bank can never be in a position to do. There's no one on the left. I don't know what that reflects.
We'll go back to the left.
Yeah.
All right, or the right for you. So thank you for everything. So my question is, as I look at American history, it seems like we rose from maybe a developing to a developed nation because of some of these advances, like mechanization of farming, monoculture, just a little bit, I know, food markets. And I'm wondering, under your model, how does one rise out of a farm that's more labor intensive and maybe become an economist? And if you can't sell your food because there's not a market, how would you move beyond a farming to maybe I hate to say more developed role, but doing other things other than farming?
Well, it's true that I mean, the history of the agricultural history of the United States is one of that involves mechanization, but it also involves democracy. I mean, that's been the really interesting thing about U.S. farming and U.S. politics is that you can watch the rise of agrarian democracy and then its demise in the late 19th and early 20th century. I mean, it seems to me that the tradition that's worth drawing on is this idea of agrarian democracy, and the people I would turn to and would insist on deferring to. I mean, because no one's going to believe me in terms of how to shift a farm from this kind of large-scale mechanized system to a more sustainable one. But the people to listen to are the National Family Farm Coalition, and I find their views incredibly important. They are part of an international movement called La Via Campesina, which is an international peasant movement of over 200 million members around the world. And they have ideas about precisely the kinds of transition that are necessary, that involve things like investment in agricultural research that isn't about keeping us on the sort of the narrow track of monoculture, but it is about building soil fertility, that is about increasing yields through these kinds of agroecological mechanisms, that is about research to make sure that it can scale up. And they have, through these ideas of food sovereignty, I think that there are exciting things to learn. But I'm not the guy to tell you about that. And it's okay for me not to be the guy to tell you about that. I mean, the farmers that I know and have spoken to are not going to be persuaded by someone like me with an accent like mine. But what they are going to be persuaded by is seeing it work successfully on a neighbor's farm. And for that, the National Family Farm Coalition has that in abundance. So, I mean, I would certainly urge you to go to NFFC.net.
Yeah, I guess I'm less concerned about the transition, but how does that farmer on the polyculture farm, how do their children then move off the farm and do something else? So if they can't sell their product, or if it's a more labor-intensive system, like you mentioned with the plantain plantations, where's the opportunity to do something other than farming?
That's a great question. I'm sorry I misunderstood. If you're looking at the way that agriculture is going to work in the future, we're going to need to use much less water and much less fossil fuel. The kinds of economics of American farms at the moment are premised on plentiful amounts of fossil fuel, for sure, and less so water in this part of the country, but still a great deal of it. As climate patterns change and become less predictable, we are going to see ourselves doing less of the kind of massive farming out here. But certainly what the ISTAT report, the IASTD report, calls for is more urban and peri-urban farming, which means a lot more flow between urban and rural areas. Although we have this idea of the city is this and the rural area is that. But what they're suggesting is that the areas in which we farm are going to be much more porous. And so the exchange between the city and the country is going to happen much more. Right now there's this huge, there's a massive geographical divide. But again, if you look to somewhere like Cuba, I mean, again, I don't want to live in Havana, but what I do want to have is the kind of democratic conviction and organizing that Cuban peasants have and the Cuban people have. And if you look to Havana, 70% of the food that is eaten in Havana comes from Havana. So certainly getting used to more urban and peri-urban farming is not only sort of offers the kind of possibility of exchange between rural and urban areas and the room for these aspirations to flourish, but also a smaller carbon footprint, a better kind of diet, and a more sustainable future. The left has piped up.
So straying not too far from food, but talking about land ownership and the land grab specifically in Africa. The concept of China becoming a more present force in Africa and their using of natural resources there has come to my attention recently. And I just wanted to know your thoughts as far as south-to-south development and whether this is progress for Africa.
It's very interesting if you look at the newspapers in Europe. They're very concerned with these issues, particularly of China's presence in Africa. And if you look, I was in Malawi recently, and there, the Parliament building has been built by China and the five-star hotel next door. And if you go to if you see the African Union headquarters, we were talking about this earlier on, where Africa is a continent of many languages, and so like at the United Nations, you have these translation earphones and a dial to select which language you listen to, and the number one dial at the African Union built by the Chinese is Mandarin. So that's the number one, that's the Pan-African language that they're keen on. And you see this in European newspapers with this. Basically, they're saying, look, you won't believe what they're doing. They're doing what we did. And it's useful to put that into perspective, I think. While there is this new scramble for Africa, there was an old scramble for Africa too. Why? The reason that Africa looks the way it does is because of a conference in Berlin that divvied up the continent between European powers. So in that sense, of course, this isn't new. What is new is precisely the sort of, and of course, and it's not just the South that is interested in Africa. Of course, our country has recently started AFRICOM, the Central Command for African Theatre of Operations, which is suspiciously close to where the oil is. Though of course, there's some debate about where it is that they're having trouble locating it because African countries don't want yet another force there. So at the moment, I think it's in Frankfurt. But AFRICOM is soon to find a home in Africa. So is South-South cooperation a good thing? Well, it's interesting. I worked at an organization called the SEATINI, the Southern and Eastern African Trade Information Negotiations Initiative. See, they went to they went to acronym school, SEATINI. And there, the director was very excited because back in the day, this day would have been around about 2000, when China entered the World Trade Organization. He was super excited because he was like, at last, the People's Republic will stand up for us and they will take on the imperialists. And he was a bit of red, my boss. So he was like, they will take on the running dogs from America and Europe, and they will fight them. But of course, it hasn't quite turned out that way. And it turns out that the new boss is the same as the old boss. So I'm kind of suspicious. On the other hand, African countries are saying, well, look, we've been asking for investment and aid forever, and now finally someone's coming. Isn't that great? And they're coming not just from China, but from India and from Brazil. Brazil has a special sort of deal with Mozambique to grab land there. India's doing Indian entrepreneurs are doing interesting things in Ethiopia, for example. So you're seeing a lot of this sort of South-South thing. But it seems to me that the same logic of exploitation applies. And that's very distressing. And I don't see it as a positive thing. I don't think that land grab should happen. The Food and Agriculture Organization has proposed a way of some guidelines to suggest that what we need is rule of law and transparency and all this kind of thing. And I'm for rule of law. I think that that's a good thing. But if you look at all the places where land grabs have happened or are likely to happen, it's precisely the absence of the rule of law that makes land grabs more likely. As I say, there's no willing buyer or willing seller here. What you have is a suspension of the rule of law. There's no open market in land. There's backroom deals. If you were to have rule of law, I suspect that the land grabs would happen less. But frankly, they shouldn't happen at all. When even The Economist agrees with me and suggests that there's something rather like colonialism at work here, I think that it's pretty clear that something like this is not in Africa's best interests. And again, it's important to remember, the only reason this was something that makes sense is because Africa is still paying off the debts that it has incurred for many years and needs some form of foreign exchange. I think debt forgiveness is a good way of preventing the necessity of land grabs in the first place, and that's what we need to be talking about.
I think he was next.
Yes, I'm sorry, I haven't to swing.
So a lot of your argument seems to be against the free market for food, which is, I'm not attacking you, you've made some fantastic arguments against it. Should food be protected as something separate from other commodities of the free market? Or, I can certainly see an argument for that, but I just want to know what your thoughts on.
Well, I certainly think that when you need it to live, it's probably a bad idea to ration it according to the ability to pay, right? If you need something in order to survive, why do we ration it in that way? In the way of, if you are rich enough to get it, you can. Now, to some extent, of course, we see a lot of countries have a way of decommodifying food, have a way of having a safety net to make sure that at least some people get to eat. In fact, in this country, we have the SNAP entitlements, the food stamps is what they used to be called. And that is a way of decommodifying food. And at least providing a safety net. And in fact, it is a sign of the success of the food stamp program that only 49 million people are going hungry, which seems an odd thing to say, but if you look at the curve of food insecurity in the United States, it was going up and up and up and up in 2008 and 2009, and then in April 2009 it flats. It becomes flat at 51 million. But without an increase in the food stamp ratio, it would have gone up and up and up. So yes, there are ways in which we protect and decommodify food. But I certainly think that there's something important about, I want to give a two-pronged answer to your response. One is to say there's something about things we need to survive being in markets that's perverse, and I don't think that they should be there. But the second response to you is, actually, I like markets. I think that what we need is free exchange. We need willing buyer and willing seller. The trouble is that the world in which we live is one of largely concentrated market power. If you love the market, and I think free and uncoerced exchange is a terrific thing, and we should have more of it. But the world in which we live at the moment is the anti-market, where a few corporations control the cut and thrust of markets. So I think that for those things that are not the kind of protected commodities we need to survive, we certainly need free exchange. But I think in order for the market to work its magic, we need to trust bust. We need actually more competitive and open markets than we have at the moment. And that means getting rid of the market power that's concentrated in the hands of just a few corporations in pretty much everything. So that's a way of coming back at you and saying, look, yeah, there are some things that I don't think should be in markets,
But I think that where we do have markets, we need for them to be not controlled by a few titans of the financial industry or the or whatever industry we think is important. But we need, for markets to work better, we need much more democracy, and we need to be using the power that we have already to bust the trusts that are corrupting the way that markets work today. I think that's a good enough place to stop.